So thank you very much. Project Sepik is a local NGO, and we live basically in the Sepik region. That's the northern eastern part of the country, on the mainland. So our work, really, we started doing this work because we were answering the call from the people along the river. They did a lot of work around resistance against the mine that was proposed and what they were doing in terms of developing the mine. And so we got in there simply to amplify the voice and have more visibility, not only in Papua New Guinea, but everywhere around the world, so that enablers of the mine and proponents of the mine understand that the people are against it. We've been very fortunate to work alongside with AidWatch Australia, and we value your partnership. We still call AidWatch Australia as partners in Papua New Guinea and in some of our write-ups. And I will continue to talk with especially Natalie later on after this, like we always do. So what have we done so far? In the last year alone, we worked on writing a complaint to the OECD. That was really tough because we called to ban the mine and the OECD won't accept that. And so how do we work with OECD? That's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. The office is part of your Treasury Department and it's based in Sydney. So we eventually got a response from them after almost a year. And they will come out with a statement on Monday. So we will watch out on Monday. I might make a statement in some news platforms and organizations in Australia about the response by the OECD from the Sydney office. So that was something we achieved. We also continued to build solidarity along the Sepik River because it's difficult. It costs about 30,000 kina. I don't know how much in Australia. What do you say, Natalie? How much is that in Australian dollars? 30,000 kina.
I'd sort of have it, maybe a little bit less. It depends on the exchange, but probably like 15,000 Australian or a little bit less.
So every time we go from the headwaters then and the upper Sepik River all the way down to the delta, it costs 15,000 kina. This is to talk to the people, show them new movies, show them what the government is doing, and talk to them, stay at their homes and complete the process. It takes about 2 weeks to do that. It's pretty rough for our volunteers who go up and down the river doing this, because it's so easy for people to be swayed, for people to be misinformed. There are no radios, no newspapers, no news going into those places. It's still very rural and very isolated. And when I say isolated, it's not just isolated like in Australia when you go into the desert. It's isolated from the rest of the world, where there is no electricity, running water, news, TV, magazines, newspaper, and radio stations. So that's the kind of environment we work in. And in the last year alone, we secured 3 funding from major donor agencies, and one of them is funding us for 3 years. So that's really great. Usually we struggle, and so I would ring up Natalie and say, can you credit my phone 20 kina or $20? And she does, so that I'm able to call my volunteers out on the field. So yeah, that was something we did last year. Going forward, we're excited to say that in the last, sorry, I'll pause. Going forward, but before I get to the going forward part from here, when I started this work in 2019, the first funder from Norway called me over and said, Manu, you want to stop the mine? And I said, no, I can't stop the mine. I can't stop Australian government. I can't stop Papua New Guinean government, and I can't stop the Chinese government. I don't think I can do that, but I can promise you we'll delay them. And that we did. We did fantastically, and Jubilee and all our partners, including AidWatch Australia, was right there. So this is the part where we cheer a bit, we clap, yeah? Yay, thank you. So we delayed them by 2 years and still going on because they were supposed to get their environmental permit 2 years ago and they didn't. And so from talking to people we know, they said, Manu, okay, so you've delayed them, what now? So that's now going forward. We have offering all kinds of protection by decolonizing all those laws, processes, and systems that they use, because these were written up a long time ago. And so these laws and all the systems, the processes that they use, the methods, they are based on outsiders coming in to exploit. And so wherever there are little points that we will change it so that we are on the we are with them in terms of the discussion, or we are ahead of them in terms of the discussion. And that's where we should be. So that's where we're going, offering protections around those laws, processes, systems. We're also working with the University of Papua New Guinea, James Cook University, and University of New South Wales, Australian National University in moving forward the World Heritage so that we can get it there. It's really great because it wasn't easy to work with SEPA, Center for Conservation Environment Protection Agency. That's the agency that is my enemy, that is our enemy, because it gives the environmental permit to the mine. But now we're like buddies with them, sitting down, having coffee with them. So that's good. But we're having coffee with, the stinky eye. So so we're doing that because we want to work with them to get the national protected area and then moving that to the World Heritage. And we've got a memorandum of understanding with the University of Papua New Guinea. And that process took only 3 months to get the MOU. So that was really fantastic in terms of getting the support from the University of Papua New Guinea to do this work. And we also got funding for this work from Global Environment Facility and James Cook University, together with the University of Papua New Guinea and Project Sepik, are going into getting funding from the Australian Research Council, I think, for this work. So going forward we've delayed the mine and we're now putting in protections. I think that's where we are. And we're working with communities, facilitating processes, not bringing, but facilitating processes to help them with sustainable livelihood projects. Thank you. I think I'll end there. Thank you very much for your time and to listen to this.
Thanks so much, Manu. Really appreciate it. It's an extraordinary campaign and movement on the ground, and it's resonated right across Papua New Guinea with some of the other people I work with. So thank you for the sacrifices you've made, because I know there's many. And just keeping on going. It's amazing. We will have Q&A at the end, so if you've got any questions, you can put them in the chat, or we can wait till the end. So thank you, Manu. Now I'm going to invite Liz Downs to speak. So Liz is the coordinator of the Rainforest Information Centre, and as we've said before, is leading this co-research that we're doing together around Australia's sort of footprint in that green extractivism space. But Liz has many years' experience working on the ground in Ecuador, and that's probably one of her passionate areas, particularly focused on Australian developments there. So Liz, I will leave it to you. I've made you a co-host, so if you want to share the screen, just go ahead.
Sure. The Rainforest Information Centre is relevant because we, back in the day, was it how many years ago, Nat? Gave some funds to actually start AidWatch.
Yes, so if you actually go to our website and you go to about, there's a little section of how AidWatch became about, which was, the co-founders were Lee Rhiannon and Carol Sherman. There's also a little PDF there, I think it was the 10-year anniversary of AidWatch, in which John Seed, who's the founder of the Rainforest Information Centre, talks about supporting and helping AidWatch and really backing AidWatch to come about. So there's been this history. I think Rainforest Information Centre is 40 years old and we're 30 years old, but there's been this little history over the years of, relationship and between the two organisations. And I think part of that is we do hold a similar political mandate, even though in some ways Rainforest Information Centre has been focused on rainforests. I think now as like AidWatch has gone beyond just the aid lens, Rainforest Information Centre has also realised that there's all these intersecting issues that we need to deal with.
Great, thanks, Nat. So while you were talking, I still have no idea how to share my screen. So unfortunately, my lovely presentation is going to have to be not shared. And I'll just talk, which I'm quite good at. It's just all the photos and maps, you won't be able to see them. But anyway, just to give you an idea of, so the Ecuador campaign, that started five years ago. It actually started about 30 years ago when Ecuador had volunteers. When Rainforest Information Centre had volunteers in Ecuador, as in other parts of the world, working with some Indigenous people, with Guarani and Awa Indigenous people in different parts of Ecuador to do some stuff with land rights and also keeping out logging, poaching and oil. Since then, the problem in Ecuador has moved from mainly poaching and oil and logging to mining. Ecuador has become a mining country in the last few years and has just basically slathered up the entire country, about a total of 7 million hectares of quite a small country, which is also the most biodiverse country in the world. It is also home to 14 different Indigenous nations, distinct Indigenous nations, who have distinct political organisations. Is open to mainly copper mining, and this copper mining is mainly getting, because the copper price has risen, because copper is in great demand for the green energy transition, which is where green extractivism comes in. We didn't know all this when 5 years ago, basically, John Seed emailed a bunch of us and said, oh my God, you realise that Los Cedros Protected Reserve is under threat from grand scale mining. And we were like, what? And I was already in Ecuador at the time and just doing stuff. And I went over to Los Cedros. I said, oh, I'll take a few photos and, just talk to some people. And anyway, John got sick and I ended up taking on the Ecuador Endangered campaign from there when we found out that, there was all this other mining going on that was threatening all these other protected areas, critically endangered species. We've got, some incredible species in Ecuador that are endemic, Andean spectacled bears and jaguars and things, and Indigenous lands. So when we looked into it even deeper, we figured out that about 30% of this total mining investment is Australian. So we did a fundraiser in Melbourne, and a whole bunch of people came on board from the old Melbourne Rainforest Action Group, which were incredible back in the day in the 80s and 90s, doing some really hardcore, frontline lock-on kind of activism, stopping Malaysian timber exports, imports, and doing a bunch of stuff. Anyway, so few people came on board and said, oh, we'd like to sort of help get this Ecuador campaign running. And we all got really obsessed with it and just basically worked our asses off, have worked our asses off ever since. With just basically, we get funds together from various fundraisers and we send it over to, we've got a few front lines that we mainly work with. I'm sorry I couldn't show you the beautiful photos of Gina Reinhardt and Twiggy Forrest. They are the people that are doing pretty horrific things over there. So Gina Reinhardt's over there. She's got a subsidiary of Hancock Prospecting who is has committed full-on human rights abuses. They are the most corrupt mining company known to, I don't know, they're just terrible. Anyway, so they have basically, to push their way into the community, their idea of doing that is to line up a whole bunch of trucks on the only access road to the community, block the members of the community from getting in and out. Then when the members of the community blockaded back and said, you are not going to do this, this is really wrong, they bribed the county court judge to let the police, the federal police, give them unlimited powers to move on the protesters. This happened last year. The Gina Reinhardt's company then went in. The federal police came behind with tear gas and rubber bullets, and arrested a whole bunch of people for doing absolutely nothing except sitting on the road and praying. And let the mining company in. So there's shit like that going on all the time in Ecuador with Australian companies. When we had more volunteers, we were campaigning. We were doing a whole bunch of stuff here in Australia. We did campaigns outside, protests outside mining company headquarters. We have a major problem with BHP over there, so we went to BHP's AGM, and so we're doing the best we can with the resources we've got, which aren't an awful lot. Big thing that we did achieve was that Los Cedros forest that I mentioned ended up getting a case up to the Constitutional High Court in Ecuador, and Rainforest Information Centre busted its guts and busted its donors' wallets and managed to raise about 46,000 Australian dollars to pay for the legal fees. And the reason we raised so much was because it whittles down to not very many US dollars. But we paid the legal fees for this constitutional court case, which was basically the first ever landmark case where Ecuador's constitutional laws have been able to be used to defend a forest from mega extractivism. And they won. And so the court ruled that the mining companies' exploration licenses were annulled, and they set an absolute shockwave through Ecuador's mining industry and also through the other various companies that were operating there. But still a huge, massive, long way to go with that. Ecuador's mining plan's horrific, and of course it's happening all over the world, which means Q, green extractivism. So last year, my friend Claire and I, Claire's doing a PhD at the University of Tasmania on green extractivism, and we thought, wouldn't it be interesting to see if we could get some funding and do a bit of mapping about this. So Nat managed to get some funding through AidWatch, and we started work. It's turning into, as Nat mentioned, a fairly lengthy report. It's going to be probably about 100 pages long, because it's huge. And so what's happening in Ecuador, as many of these front lines know, is just happening everywhere. Australia's government is enabling this expansion of mining for not only copper, of course, but lithium, rare earths, which is where obviously Lee's work comes in with Linus. It's all part of this green extractive push. What else? Nickel and cobalt we're also looking at. So we're just trying to sort of get our heads around this immense, massive Goliath. And at the same time, just keep on helping out our front lines over in Ecuador as much as we can, which at the moment, basically what's happening at the moment is that from the Los Cedros win at the High Court, a couple of other communities have since launched cases based on the ruling precedents. So looking at people's constitutional rights to a clean and healthy environment and for free, prior and informed consent. And that's, so we're just managed to scrape up a few funds to get those cases off the ground. And we're just doing bits and pieces, really. So that's me, I think.
Thanks so much, Liz. And Liz also is very humble, but has put in a huge effort, to actually go on the ground and be with communities. And that's been, I don't know how long, over 5 years or something, Liz, that you've been doing that work. And like me, COVID has sort of put a spanner in the works that we can't get to the ground so much, but we still were able to advocate and really amplify those resistance stories on the ground and like kind of hold the corporations accountable and other people accountable. So thank you so much. And I am really excited to be working with you and very excited about this report that we'll be launching at the end of August. Before I continue, I wanted just to acknowledge that we've got a couple of our partners on the call. We've got Vincent from the Asia Pacific Research Network. So Vincent's in the Philippines. It's a little love heart. We've got Arjan, who's from Nepal and who's also part of the Asia Pacific Research Network and heads up a fantastic organization there. We also have Kat, there he is, hey. We have Kat too from ActionAid Australia, who we've always sort of keep in touch. It's been a while actually, Kat, but it does really fantastic work around gender justice and many other issues with ActionAid. I also want to acknowledge Beverly on the call. Beverly Longrid from the Philippines is a very strong and powerful Indigenous leader. So I'm really excited to have you here, Beverly. And also, I'm not sure who you are, but it looks like we have the Initiative for Rights from Bangladesh, also someone from, I think it might be, can't quite read the name, but it's really exciting to have partners and friends that are outside Australia and shows sort of who AidWatch is really. You know, our work is about how Australia is impacting our region. And we can't do that without these partners and these friends. So yeah, I just want to acknowledge and say thank you. Also, before we go on to the next speaker, who is Lee Tan, I have been putting some links into the chat, so have a look. There was some links on the Save the Sepik campaign, and Manu's a bit of an apology. The internet's going in and out, so he might come in and out. And also some links to some of the work that Liz was talking about. But I'm now going to hand over to Lee Tan, who I've had the great honor of working with for many, many years, who called me back in 2011 and said, there's an Australian company in the town that I grew up in Kuantan. And sort of ever since, she has been fighting against this, a pretty incredible campaign and a very strong movement in Malaysia. So I'm going to hand over to you, Lee, to give us a bit of an update of what's been going on and the incredible work you've been doing along with our partners in Malaysia over the last year or so or more.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Yeah, thank you, Nat, for your kind introduction. Yeah, it's really sad that after 10 years, we're still fighting this particular company, and is, while it's radioactive waste piling up in once a pristine peat mangrove in Malaysia, as you can see on this slide. Are the slide up there? I mean, can you see the slide? Okay, good. So that's the plant up top, and then that's the waste. I mean, this white color waste is the lesser radioactive contaminated waste, but it's piled up to about 10-story high, whereas the red bits at the top and also at the bottom is the actual radioactive waste that needs to be managed and isolated from the natural environment. And here you see these little children playing innocently and unbeknowingly at the river mouth, where the wastewater from Linus rare earth processing plant flow and drain into the South China Sea. Anyway, it's the reason why AidWatch and I picked up this mining campaign is because just from my decades of working in international development, I have found Australian mining company to leave toxic legacy, in Papua New Guinea, in Africa, in South America, in Asia. It's like, when I started working for ACF in 1999, which is the Australian Conservation Foundation, as their Asia Pacific coordinator, the first field trip I made was to the Oktedi mine in Papua New Guinea. And then when I finished with ACF in 2011, it's Linus Corporation at that time, which is now named as Linus Rare Earth Limited, operating in, of all place, my hometown in Kuantan in Malaysia. And that's why I kind of, feel like mining is a very essential, or well, it's a very important topic or campaign to take because of the Australian government support. And I will talk a little bit more about that tonight. So what are rare earths? Rare earths are a group of 17 elements in the periodic tables, and they have very special properties that have found applications, particularly in the electronic and high-tech end of the industry. And they are today considered critical and also strategic metals for many countries, particularly the advanced industrialized nations, including Australia. And rare earths are considered strategic because of the role that rare earths have in the weapon technologies, particularly the high power weapons. And which is one reason why Pentagon has given so much money, millions of dollars, to Lynas to develop separation plant in Texas, in joint venture with another Texas chemical company. Rare earth is also used in a whole range of modern high-tech gadgets, which we all use every day: laptop, iPhone, etc., etc. And of course, in the emerging green energy transition technologies, whether it's wind power turbine or electric cars, even your LED lights and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, with rare earth, the monazite is one example of rare earth ore. There are different types. This iron adsorption, clay, and then there's also the bastnite and so on and so forth. But the monazite ore, which Lynas possess through its Western Australian Mount Weld mine, contained a significant amount of radioactive thorium and uranium. And also because of this presence of radioactive materials, thorium and uranium are two elements or radioactive elements identified by health authority and environmental agency to be long-living radioactive materials that should be regulated and also kind of isolated from the environment because of the public health implication. I mean, these are radioactive elements with billions of half-life, which means they remain radioactive, for as long as the Earth or the whole galaxies are around, and therefore they continue to pose public health and environmental health hazard. And because of the presence of these radioactive materials, it is unsurprisingly that China has become the dominant supplier of these rare earth elements. USA and Australia were, and several other kind of OECD, the advanced industrialized nations, used to be the major producer of rare earth until the 70s, when studies on health impacts of low dose radioactive exposure becomes known in the scientific circle, particularly the US, in Australia, in Europe. So the EPA started to kind of lift the standard on radiation hazard control. So all the companies are pushing their rare earth minerals to China for processing. And of course, China at that time in the 70s and 80s was desperate for industry. So it ended up absorbing the whole industrial market, rare earth production. And now, because of the geopolitical conflict started by Trump in the US, and then of course, you know, Scott Morrison, the former PM, also joined in. So rare earth became one of the minerals, or one of the groups of minerals in dispute. And that also is one of the reasons why Linus is getting a lot of funding from Pentagon, initially from Japan, because Japan was having, you know, some trade rival with China as well. And also the Australian government's given about 40 million to Linus for a plant in Kalgoorlie boulders, and we'll talk about that later. And this is what Linus is doing. It has this mine in Mount Weld in Western Australia, and it truck that, and then it mined it, and then it concentrate, concentrate them into rare earth concentrate, and then truck it to Fremantle to be exported some 6,500 kilometers to the port of Kuantan. And from there, it goes into the processing plant, and then, you know, extract rare earth oxide. I mean, that plant is not a refinery. It's really only a secondary processing plant. And it extracts different types of oxides and carbonites and chlorides from the rare earth concentrate, and leaving behind huge amount of toxic and radioactive waste in Malaysia. And the area which this plant is located was once a pristine peat mangrove. And these are some of the photos I took back in 2012 along the river where the wastewater goes in. And today, you know, next to the Linus plant, you see this multi-story high toxic waste piling up, you know, day in, day out by Linus truck. Yeah. And also around the plant are fishing villages, and also ecotourism resort areas, which create plenty of employment opportunities for the local people, and also has a lot of positive economic impact locally. But none of those studies from Linus look into that. In fact, they did not even consider social or ecological issues, and neither did they look at the economic implication, and also the reputational damage that its radioactive waste will bring to these places. So there are many problems associated with it. And you know what Linus did in Malaysia was very much against what it would be required to do in Australia. I think back in 2012, when we advocated Stop Linus Save Malaysia, which is the Malaysian residents group set up by local people to campaign around this. We went to Canberra, we lobbied the government, you know, different MPs and so on and so forth. And we had Kevin Rudd at that time, being the foreign minister, writing a letter in response to Senator Doug Cameron, a Labour senator, saying that, you know, Australian government would expect Linus Corporation, or Linus Rare Earth now, to adhere to the same standard as it would in Australia, but of course, none of that got followed through. And instead, you know, what Linus did was generating many of these kind of spins saying that, you know, its plant has zero harm, the river will still be safe, and people can continue with their recreational activity downstream, and so on and so forth. And all of which are very dangerous, you know, for people in around the area, because they are not highly technically sophisticated to understand the complexity of the health hazard of radioactive materials, or of its toxic heavy metals that can be leached and which has been leached from the waste and so on and so forth. And because of that too, you know, and Linus went to Malaysia in a time period when the government was particularly corrupt, where the former prime minister who has been ousted now, Najib Razak, was embroiled in an international financial corruption scandal known as the 1MDB scandal. And yeah, and because of all of that too, you know, people were very unhappy that they left with the toxic waste, you know, the country's money, public funds being siphoned out by the prime minister at that time, you know, to be parked in expensive New York apartment in Australia and so on and so forth. So, you know, there were lots of protests back in the 2011, 2014, and Nat can also share with you her own experience spending time in a jail in Kuantan, yeah, for her solidarity action with the local people. So Nat, do you want to say something?
I mean, I think the thing is that what I was so impressed by and what drew me, well, I was invited to come over when we did that mobilization, but why I came over was because the movement was so massive.
Yeah.
And it was very much attached to the democracy movement, of course, but and yeah, I was jailed for 7 days and no one really knew what was going to happen. But the other thing that was really incredible for me as someone who has always really advocated for solidarity was the solidarity that Malaysians gave me every single day, like even when I was locked up, was quite, it was moving. And I felt like we actually in Australia have a lot to learn by how people organize there. So yeah, but yeah, not to put the focus on me, because there are many people who've been doing all the long yards and hard yards. I just took a moment of having solidarity and I got arrested for it. I sat on the ground. That's all I did. Nothing special.
Yeah, and I mean, the reason why I want to explain, you know, why Ned was in jail is it's also indicative of the kind of system of what do you call that? Weak governance or corrupt governance that is in place in Malaysia at that time. And even now, it's the same. I mean, unfortunately, the Malaysian politics very complex. Yeah, they had a popularly elected government back in 2018. They've done some inquiry to try and lift the standard of operation of Linus, and then 2 years later, back in 2020, just before the pandemic lockdown, that particular popularly elected government was ousted again through a coup within you know, some of the ruling elites in Malaysia. So yeah, in terms of Malaysia, the political will to change is not there. And also the technical capabilities also absent. The environmental agency did nothing about all the pollution, the contamination, and also the breaches of license condition, and so on and so forth. And so now back to Australia, Linus is also building a plant. That was because of the 2018 change of government in Malaysia. Before it got ousted, it imposed a condition on Linus to not bring in any more ore concentrate that's radioactive. So Linus started to build this plant in Kalgoorlie, Boulder, in Western Australia. But what it has offered us at AidWatch are opportunities to engage with the Western Australian EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, to, you know, set a high benchmark, or at least as high as possible within the Australian regulation and guidelines. And you know, through most of last year, Mara and myself, also through and with RMIT professor Gavin Mudd, we managed to put in submissions both at the EIA community consultation process and later through an appeal, to actually get some very basic standard up that, you know, the radioactive waste that Linus generate from its plant cannot be left, you know, in places where, you know, there are residents and there are people living. It has to go back to the mine site and to be managed and scrutinized and regulated. Yeah, for at least 1,000 years. I mean, not, and that's the basic condition in Australia, which Linus has to follow. And we can then now advocate for, yeah, in alongside Malaysian as well, to get Linus to actually remove the waste, to return it to the mine site, since it has already a perfect location. No, it's not perfect, but it's better, the kind of best possible location in a semi-arid environment as compared with a wet tropical rain-drenched country like Malaysia with weak governance. So that's what we're trying to do. And AidWatch and myself and other people have continued to support Malaysian in their EIA kind of EIA consultation and so on and so forth for a permanent waste dump in Malaysia. We continue to object to that and protest against that. And that is still ongoing. We're working with Friends of the Earth Malaysia and to a lesser extent Greenpeace Malaysia, but you know, they're very much on site to keep insisting that the proposal put forward by Linus for a permanent dump site in Malaysia is inadequate, which it is technically, and that we want the waste to be removed from Malaysia, to return to a place that has been set aside by the Western Australian government, to be managed at least to a high degree of environmental kind of standard in its plant, in its mine. So that's where we're at. Like, of course, you know, Linus is playing up its importance, yeah, through court and also through AUKUS. And I'm sure Clinton will explain a little bit more on some of the militarization issues later. But, you know, this company is very, very manipulative in getting governments in the advanced developed world to support its operations. And that's why it was able to play geopolitics, you know, against China. I mean, to some extent, rightfully so, but it's also wrong to do that by leaving so much radioactive waste in Malaysia. We're not objecting to having rare earth mines or processing because of its importance in you know, in the green energy transition, but we just want it to be just. We want it to be clean and green, and we want it to be well. We want to see Australian mining companies to be competitive, not by lowering the standard, not by raising to the bottom for its ecological kind of footprints, but you know, to do better than what other countries are doing, and least of all, not to exploit a corrupt government to basically make money out of it. I think that's all I can say, and I'll be happy to answer any question after this. Okay.
Thank you so much, Lee. And I think you're right. Like, I think we've talked a little bit of green extractivism tonight, and, you know, in no way are we advocating against moving to, you know, this transition and renewables, but it has to be, these supply chains have to be looked at. We can't do business as usual. And I think that's something that's a conversation that's not happening enough. And we hope at AidWatch, particularly with what Lee's doing and the research we'll be producing, that those dialogues can really start to take place. So our final speaker is Professor Clinton Fernandez, who's on our he's on our management team. And he is a professor of international and political studies at the University of New South Wales. So I invited Clinton because he's got some brilliant analysis of sort of international development and security in the region. And I was really interested in him to sort of finish tonight to bring a little bit back to the aid, because we are AidWatch, but militarization of aid in the region. And also now we have ALP in power, like what that could look like and what maybe the opportunities are. So I'm just going to hand it over to you, Clinton.
Thank you. Right, I'll try and be brief. I know everyone's got other meetings to go to. First, I'm just saying I'm sorry I couldn't take up the chair position. I've just finished my semester and I'm going on long service leave, and I'm trying to lose weight, and my blood pressure and so on should be all right in about 6 to 12 months. I mean, that's a priority for me. I'm on medication, which I'm not used to doing. Okay, so I'm going to make 3 points, which are the core of what I'd like to tell you. These are all my views, not anybody else's views. Firstly, world order is changing. That means regional order is changing too, but world order is changing. Not since the Second World War have the changes been so drastic and dramatic, and we're just at the start of it. The majority of countries in the world have voted to condemn Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, but the majority of countries in the world have not joined in the campaign of economic sanctions. In fact, what they're worried about is a major food crisis. And as a result, there's a potential for some kind of a coalescing of the global South, but not in an independent, quasi non-aligned way, but perhaps around the BRICS system, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus. You also see growing alliances over energy, Saudi Arabia and Russia. And these obviously have, implications for the biggest geopolitical project in history, which is Eurasian integration, the Belt and Road Initiative, as well as the other recipient countries and their involvement in this. So now this has big implications for our region because world order is changing. And that means in our region, as China's development footprint gets bigger and bigger, it's welcomed in large parts of the Southwest Pacific by certain sectors and not by others. But for Australia, it's not the people, I mean the government. It's regarded as some kind of a threat that perhaps there's a Chinese military base around the corner. And one shouldn't be distracted too much by the fantasies of national security chin strokers, because their whole attitude and they're designed and they're raised to generate threat scenarios. And then, they kind of pretend as if these scenarios, which are only in their heads, is a reality. But this leads to the militarization of the aid program. And it also leads to some benefits for the people of the region. The Pacific Islands Forum, for example, has just seen a diplomatic offensive by Australia with the Prime Minister, showing up, the Foreign Minister visiting many, many times, and greater attention being given, an attempt to compete with China for infrastructure. And just to give you a sense, I mean, if you look at Solomon Islands, it's about say half the size of Tasmania. So imagine a landmass that's half the size of Tasmania, but broken up into about 700 or 900 islands that stretch from, say, Melbourne to Brisbane. Okay, so that's how vast it is, which means, even if it was a rich country, it would still have huge infrastructure needs. The fact that it is not a rich country, at least not according to conventional standards, it means that it has huge infrastructure needs. And the Pacific Island countries are going to try to put together some kind of a united front so they can manage both China and Australia's offerings and interests. The goal of Australian foreign policy, therefore, is likely to be how do you break up the Pacific Island unity or stop it from coalescing so that they become responsive to Australian diplomatic and geopolitical objectives. Now, this is where an aid monitoring group like AidWatch is extremely important, because we, or at least we ought to, as part of our core business, monitor what the government is doing, not from the perspective of what we think is right. That certainly comes into it, but what do the people of the region, the recipients, what do they think about our aid program? And what do they think about China's aid program? What do they think about the so-called Blue Pacific, which is the idea of the Pacific Islands and the oceans that connect them being treated as a continent in itself? The climate change, of course, is a big issue, a major issue. One of the things that came out at the Pacific Islands Forum was that the leaders' statement said that they welcomed Australia's attempt to give climate change, action a higher priority. It was rather lukewarm, not what the spin doctors are saying it was. Welcome is kind of an okay kind of word. There are stronger words, such as what was used to describe Vanuatu's initiative to go to the International Court of Justice via the General Assembly and demand an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on whether national governments, member states of the United Nations, have a legal obligation to protect future generations by taking action to mitigate the effects of climate change. And so one thing that is likely to come up on the agenda in all this is whether the Southwest Pacific should be treated as a nuclear weapons-free zone, and what that means for nuclear-powered submarines transiting the Pacific. Clearly, there will be a lot of Australian diplomatic pressure to ensure that any Pacific Island initiatives are subordinated to Australian great power objectives. And so, AidWatch has a role there, because a foreign policy, to be legitimate, it should be based on at least the informed consent of the Australian public. And AidWatch can be in a position, maybe 12 months from now, to provide a report or regular update reports. So the specific details is up to the committee, of course, and supporters. But we have to be the voice, be the point, the go-to people for Australian aid. It's never been more important to have that kind of monitoring. And the one thing that we can do is be experts on our own aid program. That is something that allows AidWatch to reach out to every other organization in the region, local landholders, students looking for scholarships, universities and government departments in the region looking for internet connections via undersea cables. In all of those areas, it'll come through one aspect or another of the Australian aid program, and the group that they will want they'll want information about the program from is us, as an alternative to whatever the Australian High Commission says in the Solomon Islands. So those are the 3 points, I think, when it comes to the militarization of aid. A lot of the aid is going to be based on infrastructure. Some of it will be for civilian purposes. Some of it, if you build a wharf and you lengthen the wharf, you can say, well, this wharf is good because it's going to increase trade inside the region. Well, yes, but what it also does is it means that you can bring bigger and bigger frigates and destroyers and so on into the region in order to militarize it. And I don't believe we hear enough about what the people of the region actually prefer. And perhaps over the next few years, that is another aspect that AidWatch can highlight. I think that's basically the 3 points I'd like to make about the militarization, just about the aid program. World and regional order is changing, and it means that the countries in the region have more options. And for Australia, the role of an aid monitoring group has never been more important.
Thank you so much, Clinton, and a really great way to finish off these extraordinary presentations. I know Vincent, who's here from APRN, we're part of the militarization workstream of the Asia Pacific Research Network. So Vincent, I'm sure, yes, a big love heart, was probably very, very excited to hear your analysis. And I think this is definitely an area we need to delve into more. So I really appreciate your analysis, your vision, and yeah, I'm very grateful you remaining on our committee of management, and I managed to rope you in from the beginning.
Oh, thanks for the opportunity to be part of AidWatch. It's obviously I couldn't say no, but I wish I could do more, and I hope to be in a position to do that in 12 months' time.
Well, I think we just do what we can, and a huge thanks to everyone and anyone who's been on the Committee of Management of AidWatch, because everyone who is a volunteer. So, and I know that everyone who's been involved does extraordinary work in their own right. So I'm really super grateful that we have such a strong committee, and we've got some new people like Liz who's here today. So yeah, I feel like sometimes we lack in the funds and the capacity, but we definitely have the mandate. I think, James, you always said that we've always had a very strong political mandate, and that's what makes us very unique and is probably part of our survival. So on that note, I'm going to hand it back to James to maybe give a few comments. But we're going to do question and answer. I don't know if there are any questions. I know there's been some questions in the chat. I actually think there was a really good question, which I don't know if we can answer, but is definitely a discussion point from Ian. Does our new Labor government plan to reinstate AusAid? May go somewhere to separating trade and aid and reduce some of these problems? I think it's a really good question. I don't think we can say yes or no, but Clinton, you may
yeah, we can say that we'll find out in late October, early November, because that's when the federal budget's going to come out. At the moment, the Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister, is operating within the parameters set by the previous government. But when the new government's first federal budget comes out, that's going to be in October, and there will be a chance to put questions to the government via the Senate Estimates Committee. They may reinstate AusAid as a separate entity. I don't know. If it were, it's still the government that runs it in great power interests. And well, I don't believe there's going to be an automatic kind of benefit just by recreating AusAid.
Yeah, we need to reimagine what aid and development is completely. Are there any other questions to our other speakers? Manu, unfortunately, due to internet access has dropped off, but any questions you want to field to me, I can field to him. But yeah, if there's any questions or queries, and if you don't feel like you want to ask them now, I'm going to put my email in the chat, and you are more than welcome to get in touch with me whenever about the AGM or about anything to do with the AidWatch. It's really great to have everyone here. Are there any questions, any thoughts, any comments? No?
I can butt in here, but I mean, I think just to thank everyone. It was a fascinating set of agendas for us, and I think things have been moving on from when we last discussed these issues last year and the year before. I think, and certainly we've been picking up on them much more directly in some of our work, which is of course to everyone's credit, particularly Nat and others. I some of these discussions, in fact, some of these very interesting political discussions about issues we've been having every month almost with our committee meetings. And I mean, it may be worthwhile us thinking about trying to open up those more generally and more thematic sort of discussions for us to hold in a fairly informal way with our partners, friends, and so on, who we want to collaborate with. It might be a good way to open up our process a bit more. I mean, to be honest, we don't talk much nuts and bolts these days in our committee meetings, which is fantastic. We talk about these kinds of issues and what we think how best we can approach them. So I think maybe we could think about sort of opening up the COM meetings a bit more widely and maybe organizing them by theme or whatever. But just again to thank everyone, and I think that was I think it's been very good. We've now started the habit of having this kind of AGM, thanks to Nat, where we actually deal with the mechanics early on and we get into the issues, which is fantastic. So and thanks to everyone for coming along and participating. If there's any other final points we want to make, I think if there isn't, then we can probably all go off and have our dinner in this part of the world. So Nat, is there anything else you want to say before we finish? Okay.
No, if you're not a member, maybe.
Oh well, we need everybody. We need everyone to join, of course, but also to donate. Donate.
Part of that is, I totally respect some people choose not to take membership, and we definitely have people who are regular donors and choose not to be a member. And part of it is a governance thing that we have to have a certain amount of members, but also we kind of want to build this. I think AidWatch is not about building it to have like lots of funding and lots of workers. It's actually been, and as we're coming out of, we're still in this pandemic, but coming out of it a lot more. And my connection with AidWatch when I first found AidWatch was probably late 90s or early 2000s, because AidWatch used to do these public events often.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, these sort of discussions. And I think that's kind of where we can have some strength, because we're taking on certain issues with an independent approach, and that often means maybe a little bit more of radical analysis, or being able to have more of a radical analysis, which then in turn really supports some of our partners who maybe can't have that, you know, and building those sort of broader movements and alliances. So yeah, I think becoming a member is great. You support us. It's not just a financial thing, it's actually being able to engage more with us and help us define and move where AidWatch needs to go. So really ask people to do that. And of course, if you have any funds, we're more than happy. And I'm just laughing at Lee right now because she must be really cold and cast away.
I think we should let Lee go inside. So I think we should wrap up there on that note. Yeah, thanks so much, everyone, and we'll all be in touch soon. I think.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time. Yes, and solidarity, Vincent. Yeah.